Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, we praise Allah, Creator of the heavens and the earth, and we send peace and blessings to all of the prophets, and especially to our beloved Prophet Muhammad, his family, his companions, and all those who call to his way to the Day of Judgment. And we begin with the greeting words of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, sent his followers to the four corners of the earth. And over the centuries, there were high points for Muslims, and there were also low points. Muslims were kings and slaves. And in all different aspects of life, in different levels of testing, Muslims who practiced their faith were able to come to the surface, as followers of the greatest prophet who ever lived. It is reported in the European slavery that went across from the Atlantic that as many as 30% of the slaves who came from Africa into the Americas and were taken as political prisoners to the Western Hemisphere were Muslims. Many of these people are still revisiting their roots, and this is making Islam the fastest growing religion in the West. This is a very important topic. We need to go deep into what actually happened to the slaves to try to understand this phenomena, because it is still influencing American society today. It still has a powerful impact upon the shaping of the minds of the younger generation and upon what is happening in the Western countries. Originally, when slavery was practiced in America and in this Western Hemisphere, the first slaves were actually the poor whites. But because they could identify with the masters, with the upper class, they refused to stay within a state of slavery. Slavery was then changed to the Red Indians, to the native people of America. But the native people were living on their land. And so they refused also to remain in slavery, and either they would sit down and refuse to move until they died, or they would fight to their death and they would escape. So the European colonialists at that time needed to have people who could easily be identified and also were familiar with the growing of cotton and sugarcane and living within a semi-tropical climate. And so they looked to the west coast of Africa to try to bring in slaves who would fit this role and who would propel the culture to give products for the industrial revolution that was about to happen. The first slaves were brought into the New World around 1518. And this was through the Portuguese and the Spanish, who gave out licenses in 1518. And then we find slaves coming in. After that point, we find then the Dutch, the British, the French, and all of the colonial masters at the time were selling people as you sell chattel. And this slavery continued and increased until the point where millions of people were affected by it. And so we can say that through the slave trade and through what happened in what is called the Middle Passage in between Africa and the Americas, that millions of people actually met death and destruction, and Africa up until today has not recovered from this terrible genocide that went on. All tribes, all languages, all religions in West Africa were brought together and put onto the slave boats. Ashanti, Coromante, Yoruba, Igbo, Wolof. Amongst them were Muslims. Almost 1 in every 3 of the slaves being taken to America was Muslim. The Mandinka, the Fulani, the Hausa, and from the Yoruba and Ashanti, those who had accepted Islam also found themselves on the boat. In early America, it was also reported that some of the African people who were living in America had slaves, that they owned their own property. But in 1685, the Code Noir, the black laws were written, and in this divisive legislature that was passed, every person of African descent became a slave. And so, with no hope for freedom, resistance became a powerful message amongst the African slaves. And we find that many of the different nations, especially the Muslims, were leading the forces against the slave masters and the colonial regimes. And reports are coming especially of Mandingos, which is the English way of saying Mandinka, from the Mande people. And we know that this is one of the largest language groups and cultural groups in West Africa. And they became the leaders of the resistance in many parts of the Caribbean and in South America. So we find, as some examples, in 1833, a female plantation owner, Gertrude Carmichael, she was living in St. Vincent and Trinidad in the Caribbean. She writes within her writings, and these are available today, that many Negro nations are not idolaters, but they are Mahometans. So she used this word Mahomet, which is a crusading word, a Middle Age terminology used for Muslims. Byron Edwards, in his famous History of the West Indies in 1794, he speaks about an old, faithful Mandingo servant. And when he describes him, he said he never forgot his morning or evening prayer. And he used to chant in a very shrill voice, La ilaha illallah. There is no God but Allah. Robert Madden, a British magistrate who went to Jamaica during the time when slavery was being abolished, he discovered a society of Muslims living in Jamaica. And Robert Madden had traveled in Turkey and in some of the Islamic lands, so he learned to speak some Arabic. He knew how to greet Muslims and to open up a conversation in the Arabic language. So it is reported that he gathered together a group of the slaves who were about to be put into a higher level of life and to be manumitted from slavery. And he recognized something different about them. He could see that they were probably Muslims. So he greeted them in Arabic, and he said they would have recited the whole of the Quran if I did not tell them to be quiet. He also uncovered amongst them a wathiqa. He uncovered a document that was written in the Arabic language, and this wathiqa, or this document, became a very important piece, because what the document is speaking about, it is calling for jihad, and it becomes the basis of a great slave rebellion that happened in the years 1821 to 1822. Following this, we find that these Mandinka people are living throughout the Caribbean region. In Trinidad, the island of Trinidad, which is off the coast of South America, the Mandingo society is developed by the slaves, and this society is developed in order to free slaves, to take them out of bondage and to buy them, and to then allow them to live a free life. Also, on the island of Cuba, there was a sizable population of Muslims. Again, Mandingo is a term which is being used for all of the Muslims. In Haiti, which is the French colony, known to be the first major revolution in the Western Hemisphere, between 1753 and 1757, one of the leaders of the great Haitian uprising was Macandal. And Macandal was a Muslim imam. He was a leader. He was a learned person. And he was part of the great revolution of Toussaint Louverture that happened in Haiti. In Suriname, which was the most dangerous colony of the Dutch in that region, and Suriname is what they call today also Dutch Guyana. So it falls in South America. The great revolt against the Dutch slave masters was being led by a general called Arabi, and his lieutenant was called Zamzam, like Zamzam water that we drink in Meccatul Mukarramah. So we find Arabic names being used by people throughout the region. In the Bahamas, who are so famous today for the beautiful beaches, you find on the island of Exuma, you find writings that show a large population of people. And the writings show that these were followers of Mahomet. Now, we know that this is a middle-age crusading term that is being used to describe Muslims. So what they were actually saying is that on the island of Exuma, this large portion of the population were Muslims living in the Bahamas. And so documentation like this is coming to the surface all over the Caribbean region. It is found in South America, in Central America, that shows a strong presence of Muslims within this region. And that not only were they part of the societies, but they were the leaders in resistance. Islam gave them a strong identity. And so they resisted culturally, they resisted religiously, and it is reported that part of the system to break the slaves was not to allow them to practice their religions. And especially if the slave masters found somebody who prayed or who fasted in the month of Ramadan, that person would be tortured to death in front of the other slaves. If they found somebody who would not eat pork, or somebody who would refuse to be naked all the time, they would also torture that person. They broke up the families. They made the people change their language. They changed the names of the people from their original African names or from the names of Islamic origin, especially if the name was in Arabic. They made the people change their name, and by this they were able to water down the culture and to dissolve Islam into a large slave population. But the seeds of resistance remained in the people, and it is through these seeds that we are seeing people on these islands and these regions accepting Islam in the 21st century. Let us return after a few moments and look about an example of one of the greatest slave revolts in the Western Hemisphere. Subhanallah wa bihamdih, Subhanallah al-azim, Subhanallah wa bihamdih, Subhanallah al-azim. It is reported by historians that the slavery period in America was one of the most brutal periods in the history of this planet. Millions of people died on the shores of Africa, in the Middle Passage, and in the Americas, in the brutal serfdom, the brutal ball and chain slavery that we find all throughout this region. And because of this brutality, and because of the lack of hope, people naturally resist. And stories of resistance are written